And the class has been about race and racism, and some of the lectures have been about violence and specifically murder. And I've discussed some really disturbing cases like the murder of Cindy Gladue, who was a Cree woman who was killed and who was found in the Edmonton hotel room, and she had bled to death. And I've discussed really controversial cases like Cindy Gladue's murder and other cases that involved the killing of Indigenous women and girls. So I hope that the class has not been upsetting to you, and I hope that you've seen it as being useful in thinking about our responsibilities as settlers in Canada, and also our rights and our ethical and moral obligations to each other. So thank you very much. And I've taught the class also from an intersectional feminist and queer positive perspective. And I've also discussed Bill C-16, which adds gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code and Criminal Code, protecting transgender people's rights. And I've talked about queer people of color and transgender people of color and women of color throughout the class as well. So I think it's important to consider race and to consider policing and protest from an intersection perspective. Thank you. I will share my screen now in the PowerPoint slides, and I'll post the slides online as well. So Hanning and Dunbar have written the article, final article on the syllabus. And so this is a clip of Peter Hanning discussing police reform.
In this episode, I'd like to discuss a question that I'm probably asked more than any other question. And that is, what can and should we do to reform the police in the United States? This question has been asked, it's a never-ending question. That if you look at the history of police in the United States has always been a history of reform, history of attempting to change things and improve things and alter the way we do things. But this question has gained increased frequency and increased currency in the past few years since a series of high-profile deaths, specifically of young Black men, starting with Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then most recently, obviously, George Floyd. And the question is, what should we do? And there are reforms that are proposed. There's a huge number of reforms that are proposed, and I'm going to discuss many of them today. But I want to begin by kind of laying my cards on the table. As a policing scholar, I am a skeptic. I'm a skeptic specifically of reform. I'm a skeptic of training, and I'm a skeptic of the idea that we can make tweaks around the margins and change really the way policing functions. Now, I will also say that I am not a police abolitionist. I'm going to discuss what that perspective is in a little bit. But I'm not saying that we should get rid of the police. But I do think we need a fundamental rethinking of the way police functions in the United States. So, to begin with, the basic idea, my big point, my big takeaway, the one that I really want to emphasize, is that if we attempt to make piecemeal reforms, making these tweaks, making adjustments around the margins, without altering the fundamental dynamics of how police interact with citizens in the United States, we're not really going to change anything. We're not really going to be fixing anything. And in fact, the biggest takeaway, and one that I'm going to come back to at the end, is the idea that if we do make these series of adjustments and tweaks, what we'll have done is really spent an opportunity right? An opportunity we could have used to make more fundamental and long-lasting, and I would argue, more effective changes. So let's start with some of the big ones. One of the biggest proposals to change the police has come from under the hashtag 8 Can't Wait. And this is a series of 8 proposals that have been kind of a grouping of 8 proposals that have been widely adopted by many police departments around the country. So I want to talk about each of those 8 and what they represent and what they mean, and why I think they might be a good idea, or why I think there might be problems with the way that they're described. So let's go through these proposals one at a time. The first proposal is to ban strangleholds and chokeholds. On face, this seems like a great idea. You might say, well, why is this a problem? Of course, that's a good idea. But the problem is if you assume that banning them will mean that they won't be used, or banning them will solve a problem. So the most high profile case that I think might be relevant would be that of the death of Eric Garner. So if you recall, Eric Garner was killed in Staten Island by a New York City police officer. And the police officer used a chokehold. And that's what ultimately led to Eric Garner's death, even though the New York City Police Department had banned the use of chokeholds. So this first question of, well, is banning enough? Well, obviously banning is not enough, because when the New York City Police Department banned them, what happened? They were still used. And they're still used in this very high profile case. But beyond that, we look to see, well, what happened? Well, what happened, the officer responsible for Eric Garner's death was not prosecuted. There were no charges were brought. While there was a wrongful death suit that brought against the city, this is kind of standard practice for police departments. They, in fact, have usually funds set aside to cover these wrongful death suits. And it doesn't really change anything about their behavior. Likewise, the federal government declined to bring charges. While it is true that the officer was ultimately terminated 5 years after the incident, this question of, well, was the ban enough? I think that the conclusion would be no, by itself, the ban is not enough. Now, obviously, the argument is it's not by itself, right? It's in conjunction with a bunch of other reforms. But this, I think, sheds light on the problem. You can ban a particular practice, but this question of, does that mean it'll actually be still used or not used, is a question of what happens and how it gets implemented. When you have a ban, well, is it effective? A lot of that depends upon, well, what happens when you roll out the ban? And how do officers understand the ban? How do officers understand the regulation? How do officers understand this rule? And does it actually change officer behavior?
So the article is interesting because it does discuss policing, and you can watch the clips when I post the slides online if you choose to. The authors discuss the relationship between protest, police, and police procedures and responses to police brutality by looking at these processes from the perspective of, I think, criminology and sociology. However, one could argue that the history of policing could be discussed in relation to the history of slavery and the desire to remove certain people from the United States of America is central to white supremacist nation building. Saidiya Hartman's writings regarding slavery and the politics of Black women's birth or childbirth offers an interesting and, yes, I think disturbing understanding of biopolitics in the United States of America and throughout the global north as being connected to the building of predominantly white middle class populations of people, which has also always corresponded to eugenics and the sterilization of those who were historically deemed unfit to participate in future nation building. Racism and fascism have always been central to state power historically, and the use of police to kill is perhaps a form of fascism that is central to creating an ideal future population. Biopolitics, the value and the valorization and the celebration of certain lives and certain classes of people, their families, their children, their housing, cannot exist unless it corresponds with necropolitics, the killing of those who are imagined to have no place in a future city or country that invests in the lives of some and not others. The politics of gentrification and the kind of celebration of white middle class families and their children and their lifestyles and their avocado toast and their latte bars obviously corresponds with the policing and the murder of others, particularly working class Black people. Toni Morrison's essay, Racism and Fascism, in the book The Source of Self-Regard, does not dilute any arguments. Morrison writes of the relationship between racism and fascism and capitalism. And Morrison writes of a final solution. The construction of internal enemies, the isolation and demonization of those enemies. Morrison sees this kind of fascism as being an extreme form of capitalism. When taken to its logical extent, or when taken to its most extreme or kind of inevitability, capitalism requires a certain kind of purging. Fascism talks ideology, writes Morrison, but it is really just marketing for power. It is recognizable by its need to purge, by the strategies it uses to purge, and by its terror of truly democratic agendas. It is recognizable by its determination to convert all public services to private entrepreneurship, all nonprofit organizations to profit-making ones, so that the narrow but protective chasm between governance and business disappears. It changes citizens into taxpayers, so individuals become angry at even the notion of the public good. It changes citizens into taxpayers, writes Toni Morrison, so that individuals become angry at even the notion of the public good. It changes neighbors into consumers, so the measure of our value as humans is not our humanity or our compassion or our generosity, but what we own. It changes parenting into panicking so that we vote against the interests of our own children, against their health care, their education, their safety from weapons. In effecting these changes, it produces the perfect capitalist, one who is willing to kill a human being for a product, a pair of sneakers, a jacket, a car, or kill generations for control of products, oil, drugs, fruit, gold. When our fears have all been serialized, our creativity censured, our ideas marketplaced, our rights sold, our intelligence sloganized, our strength downsized, our privacy auctioned, when the theatricality, the entertainment value, the marketing of life is complete, we will find ourselves living not in a nation, but in a consortium of industries, and wholly unintelligible to ourselves, except for what we see as through a screen, darkly. This kind of obsessive capitalism that values life according to marketability, profit, consumerism, uh, beauty, skin color, ability, health, reproductive capacity, natalism, work, sales, happiness as a brand. Um, when taken to extremes, this kind of capitalist obsession uh, justifies the killing of those who are not productive, consumptive, and who will not be useful in reproducing the interests of and the lives of the white middle class. Dunbar and Hanning discuss the relationship between command, control, terrorism, and police in the article. And this kind of politics of surveillance is something that many authors have discussed in regards to contemporary race and racism. Jasper Puar's book, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, is one of the most well-cited scholarship regarding contemporary queer politics. And Puar argues that the construction of a gay patriot corresponds with the global war on terror and the pathologization of Muslims, Sikhs, South Asians, brown people following the global war on terror. The authors obviously discuss the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed in 2020. The protests, they write, following the murder of George Floyd, Black man, by a Minneapolis Police Department officer in May 2020 came at a time when the public largely supported calls for police reform and were characterized as the largest and most diverse in American history. These protests, like those that followed the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and other Black men, women, and children, have come to be associated with Black Lives Matter, a slogan and movement focused on racialized police violence. As with most other Black Lives Matter protests, the 2020 protests were instigated by the killing of a Black person by a police officer, condemned racialized police violence, and called for a range of police reforms. I would argue that there are many instances where transgender and queer Black people, transgender and queer non-status migrants, transgender and queer people of color with disabilities are also policed and murdered. But these cases are often not discussed. I don't want to obviously construct a hierarchy of lives or deaths or cases of police murder, but the more privileged the victim is, the more attention the case will get. And this is something that the feminist movement has argued quite effectively in looking at the ways that instances of rape and murder of white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied women often receive more media attention than the killing of other groups of women. And it's something that Kimberly Williams Crenshaw has discussed when discussing intersectionality and the killing of Black women and girls by police. And this kind of attention towards certain lives and even certain deaths is really an extreme example of necropolitics, which we have talked about throughout the class. And I think the Ashili Memembe article regarding necropolitics is one of the most interesting from the syllabus because it really is about the politics of life and death and the relationship between state power, the right to kill, and the building of the modern nation state. And the Memembe article also relates to Agamben's writings regarding homo sacer and the power of the sovereign to take a life. I think that it is important to contextualize anti-Black racism and police violence in relation to the history of slavery. Toni Morrison wrote extensively about slavery and the Black body. In an essay, The Slave Body and the Black Body, Morrison writes, quote, "What is peculiar about New World slavery is not its existence, but its conversion into the tenacity of racism. The dishonor associated with having been enslaved does not inevitably doom one's heirs to vilification, demonization, or crucifixion. What sustains these latter what sustains these latter is racism. Much of what made New World slavery exceptional was the highly identifiable racial signs of its population, in which skin color, primarily but not exclusively, interfered with the ability of subsequent generations to merge into the non-slave population. For them, there was virtually no chance to hide, disguise, or elude former slave status, for a marked visibility enforced the division between former slave and non-slave, although history defies the distinction and supported racial hierarchy. So this marking of Blackness was central to the ways that New World slavery became a form of racism. The history of New World slavery marking the formerly enslaved, and this kind of marking as being a way of degrading people who are victimized. And I would argue that this kind of real cruelty to degrade those who are victims is central to modern discrimination, that one degrades women who were raped, one degrades poor people who were historically colonized, one degrades the indigenous who are victims of crime. So the constant degradation of those who are victims is, I think, central to North American capitalism. Constantly degrading and mocking those whose bodies offer evidence of being historically maligned, stolen from, raped, hated, is, I think, central to the kind of fascism of contemporary capitalism. I mean, to hate those who are historically persecuted people, I think, is a real form of cruelty. And it is really about how the mind always will kind of construct the winners of war as being people that we should exalt. Judith Butler writes, perhaps we can think about the phrase Black Lives Matter. What is implied by this statement, a statement that should be obviously true, but apparently is not? If Black lives do not matter, then they are not really regarded as lives, since a life is supposed to matter. So what we see is that some lives matter more than others, that some lives matter so much that they need to be protected at all costs, and other lives matter less or not at all. And when that becomes the situation, then the lives that do not matter so much or do not matter at all can be killed or lost, can be exposed to conditions of destitution. And there is no concern, or even worse, that is regarded as the way it is supposed to be. This kind of survival of the fittest is really rooted in Darwinism, and in its most extreme, this logic of the survival of the fittest justifies Nazism and fascism. Butler writes, one reason the chant Black Lives Matter is so important is that it states the obvious, but the obvious has not yet been historically realized. So it is a statement of outrage and a demand for equality, for the right to live free of constraint, but also a chant that links the history of slavery, of debt peonage, segregation, and a prison system geared toward the containment, neutralization, and degradation of Black lives, but also a police system that more and more easily and often can take away a Black life in a flash, all because some officer perceives a threat. So these ideas of that which is not yet historically realized obviously propel us forward. And Judith Butler obviously is really critical of this idea that all lives matter, which was a really kind of stupid or childish and perhaps ridiculous response to the phrase Black Lives Matter. That's when something has not been historically realized. The point of political protest is to try to make it historically realized. Obviously, the value of a rich white middle class life has been historically realized through processes of slavery and colonialism. So Butler writes, the police see a threat when there is no gun to see, or someone is subdued and crying out for his life, when they are moving away or cannot move. These figures are perceived as threats, even when they do not threaten, when they have no weapon. And the video footage that shows precisely this is taken to be a ratification of the police's perception. This perception is then ratified as a public perception, at which point we not only must insist on the dignity of Black lives, but name the racism that has become ratified as public perception. So Judith Butler writes about this relationship between public perception of killing of Black people as justified and the norm of whiteness. The norm of whiteness that supports both violence and inequality insinuates itself into the normal and the obvious, understood as the sometimes tacit and sometimes explicit power to define the boundaries of kinship, community, and nation. Whiteness inflects all those frameworks within which certain lives are made to matter less than others. This obsession with normativity of the norm of the white cis het able-bodied norm as being not only an ideal, but as being a moral good is, I think, a serious problem. It's a psychological problem. It's a problem of a refusal to understand that other people are alive and have legal rights. And it's even a problem of boredom and a complete lack of creativity and the lack of a use of legal rights to actualize other realities. Canada has comprehensive laws protecting transgender rights, queer rights, anti-discrimination laws. We have rights for free speech. And so the actualization of legal rights should, I think, make it possible for someone to understand and to experience something other than this kind of really brutal normalization and standardization of life and mechanization of life. So anti-Black racism, writes Butler, presents whiteness as the normal mode of humanness. Writing in the Huffington Post, Braden Goyette writes, even among the well-intentioned, constant privilege checking turns the gaze inward and feeds white guilt, itself a dehumanizing force. The mode of the privileged discourse is confessional. It lends itself to a kind of anxious narcissism. Though I respect the privileged discourse, writes Goyette, as a corrective to the arrogance that can come with a dominant identity, it obscures the fact that everyone deserves to live in the absence of structural oppressions. So turning away from this kind of anxiety of narcissism to structural questions is, I think, central to many of the arguments that are made by the authors from the syllabus for this class, including the last article. Many authors, artists, and creative thinkers have discussed race in the last 10 years and the relationship between race, personhood, identity, and also creative expression and free speech has been central to a lot of writing about North America and North American nation building. Toni Morrison writes about the relationship between race, writing, and free speech, and also creative labor. And Morrison discusses the relationship between the Enlightenment, aesthetics, and science. She writes that the Enlightenment saw a marriage of aesthetics and science and a move toward transcendent whiteness. In this racism, the slave body disappears, but the Black body remains and is morphed into a synonym for poor people, a synonym for criminalism, and a flashpoint for public policy. There is no discourse in economics, in education, in housing, in religion, in healthcare, in entertainment, in the criminal justice system, in welfare, in labor policy, and almost any of the national debates that continue to baffle us, in which the Black body is not the elephant in the room, the ghost in the machine, the subject, if not the topic of negotiations. And I think it's really interesting to think about the relationship between anti-Black racism in Canada and Canadian settler colonialism. So the constant reference that every group of people in Canada actually has a different culture or religion or set of objects or set of clothing or signs and signifiers that we use to represent ourselves, I think can be thought of in relation to Black identity and modern Black identity. And Morrison has written extensively about the ways that American writing, art, cultural production always contains this image of Blackness as being central to how white Americans understand themselves as a norm and as innocent, but also as those who have the right to kill and to enact eugenics against others. Activism is central to our contemporary political moments. And in previous lectures, I discussed protests regarding Palestine and Israel. In the book on Palestine, Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pepe discuss activism. They write that there are questions many activists will be asked at one point or another when talking about their life, work, and their motivations with a non-activist person. Well, I often want to reverse the question they write and ask, why aren't you an activist? I usually decide with insight to try my best in answering this potentially frustrating question. Why? Because I think it is important to understand where the questions are coming from. And it is as important to look inside yourself. Take a step back, relive your journey, pause, and realize that you too, not that long ago, may have asked the same questions of anyone engaged in working towards a better world, where equality, justice, and freedom apply to all, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, country of origin, skin color, political affiliation, or sexual orientation. How then, writes Ilan Pepe and Noam Chomsky, how then does one become an activist? The easy answer would be to say that we do not become activists. We simply forget that we are. We are all born with compassion, generosity, and love for others inside us, they write. We are all moved by injustice and discrimination. We are all inside concerned human beings. We all want to give more than to receive. We all want to live in a world where solidarity and companionship are more important values than individualism and selfishness. We all want to share beautiful things, experience joy, laughter, love, and experiment together. But we have a problem. We live in a society and an epoch where we do not have time to think any longer. We live in a time when taking a step back and a deep breath have become a luxury that many cannot afford. So this time for reflection, I think, is also about the time to consider race and to seriously consider what race means in one's life, in one's work, in one's personal relationship, and what race means um, for our collective future. Sorry, and I'm citing actually the introduction by Frank Barat of this book on Palestine by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. And these questions about protest movements, the right to protest, public perception of protest, and commitments to political causes is, I think, really important in this time period because of ongoing protests regarding our collective future, regarding human rights. The article this week discusses the politics of policing and protest and the relationship between the state a commitment to politics, and the use of the police to protect private capital. Intersectionality has been at the heart of contemporary anti-racist politics, and the Black Lives Matter protests in the city of Toronto and the politics of anti-racism has been intersectional, and there have been many debates regarding policing, the use of police at Pride, at Queer Pride, and Black, queer, and transgender people have been central to contemporary social movement building and to asking us to consider the possibility of non-violence and the possibility of police abolition. White supremacy is central to discussing race in this time period, and it is often seen to be extreme to discuss white supremacy. However, I think that the existence of Nazism and fascism is still with us. And I think that one cannot really understand the ongoing tenacity of race if they do not understand white supremacy. Commodity culture and the ways that consumerism normalizes white supremacy is something that cultural studies scholars and Marxist scholars discuss extensively. In their research, Hannick and Dunbar discuss the perception of police and protest in relation to race. And many authors have argued that our understanding of the state is often informed by our positionality in regards to race and class. That one might see the state as a protector rather than an aggressor, and they might see the police as offering protection rather than as potentially doing harm to our civil liberties because of our class or racial position. And they state that attitudes towards the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests may be particularly influenced by perceptions of their makeup and means. Given their greater racial diversity, whether the presence of Black protesters at the 2020 protests, particularly in respondents' imaginations, influences evaluations of the protests themselves, remains uncertain. Anti-Black Anti-Black racial resentment has been found to negatively influence perceptions of Black Lives Matter, most notably among whites. As such, one question that arises from research related to perceptions of protest is whether perceptions of Black Lives Matter negatively influence public support for police reforms that might otherwise receive widespread endorsement. So I'll finish by discussing police, and I'll post the slides online. Today is the last day of the class, so your assignment is due, and I'm looking forward to seeing your final assignments. If you are going to submit creative work or artistic work, please include at least half a page of a written statement contextualizing your work. So Hennig and Dunbar state since the 1990s, Quinnipiac University has asked New Yorkers this question: do you approve or disapprove of the way the New York City police are doing their job? As shown in figure 1 of the article, support for police can fall after high-profile killings of Black men by NYPD officers and rise after events such as the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Decline in support following high-profile police killings is consistent with the finding that approval tends to fall after high-profile instances of excessive force. And it's interesting to think about nation building and the relationship between race and citizenship. There are times when immigrants are called upon, and migrants and even tourists are called upon to be part of white capitalist nation building. There are other times when immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are seen to be a threat to the nation, and Black Americans are often invoked as those who can participate in future nation building. The use of the model minority, who is the Asian or South Asian or religious immigrant who is extremely hardworking, committed to heterosexual family values, is often a kind of race baiting that juxtaposes certain lives against others. So anti-Black racism is often effective when every other group of people is seen to be involved in this kind of moral, heterosexual Christian family nation and corresponding forms of capital that uphold the ideal life of the ideal family or citizen. And the kind of capitalist hierarchy in place works if we all kind of support this model. So the model minority is often constructed as a hardworking Asian who will uphold North American capitalist and family values, and who will also support the policing of working class Black people. Similarly, the kind of a Black patriot who is seen to be healthy and play sports and have a great family and have perfect white teeth for America is juxtaposed to this idea of the terrorist who is outside of America, who has allegiance to other countries. And this kind of strategy always positions people of color as being at odds with each other. So the article also discusses campaigns to defund the police, and a more radical reform, the authors write, is reducing funding for law enforcement, sometimes referred to as defunding the police. And so we've discussed policing, we've discussed the relationship between race and capital throughout the class. And many of the authors that we've looked at have looked at race from a Marxist perspective and have discussed the ways that race becomes a way of dividing working class and poor people from each other and from their own interests. So this is a clip about defunding the police.
The problem is that the phrase defund the police has been weaponized against progressives and others to suggest that we support lawlessness.
So right now, the war is for semantics. It is for language. And the question becomes, how can you use language to influence culture?
Say it again. Say it again.
You know, how can you use language to influence culture? There's a vast swath of America that is terrified right now. They have no idea what's going on. They have Fox News telling them this. They have the kid that works at the grocery store telling them this. What do they do? We have to find consistency in the language and honestly find language that isn't divisive.
My name is Congresswoman Cori Bush, and I represent Missouri's 1st District. Words do matter, but people have been talking about reallocating funds as it relates to our police department, diversifying, and all of that for years. How far have we gotten? When we said defund the police, the world woke up. And now it's a mainstream conversation, and we're getting places that we weren't able to get before. So yes, words matter, but if it the thing is, when the words started happening, we need to reallocate funds. It didn't happen the way it needed to then. And so when people come against us saying, oh, well, you all are messing it up because of the way you're saying it, the way you said it didn't provide results because we got death after death after death after that. And so now when we change the words and we make people talk about it, then they want to say the problem is how we're talking about it. That's not the problem. The problem is you should have fixed the problem before we got here for me to put my mouth on it.
There you go. You explained it to me. I understand that. You broke it down.
I love my people. Gotta get it to
I
them.
know you do.
We spend upwards of $400 million a year for police in schools. We have 5,000 police officers in schools. That's larger than the Boston Police Department. That's larger than all the police officers in Las Vegas. So a divestment in NYPD means that we care more about making sure that our children have a high quality public school education, and that we also are redefining what safety is. Because at the end of the day, for those kids, my daughter went to a school with metal detectors. For those kids, they don't feel safer. Many of their first interactions with police are in schools. Why are we investing in things like that instead of investing in our children?
So Toni Morrison writes about race as an anchor that often weighs upon those who would like to produce something in the world. Morrison writes, there already exists the material from which a new paradigm for reading and writing about literature can arise. Writers have already said farewell to the old one, to the racial anchor that weighed down the language and its imaginative possibilities. How novel it would be if in this case, life imitated art. If I could have had that television interview reflecting my life's real work, if, in fact, I was not a raced foreigner, but a homegirl who already belonged to the human race. So I hope the class has allowed you to consider questions regarding humanity, race, and capital. And I've really enjoyed working with you and looking at your assignments, and many of you have produced really interesting pieces of writing, oral presentations, and creative work about race and racism. And some of the work has been really emotional and also really detailed in terms of research, and a lot of the work has also been really great because it has looked at also transnationalism and questions of caste and class and race globally. So I'll finish finally by discussing these ideas from the article, and I'll finish with a final quote. So Hannock and Dunbar then are interested in thinking about the perceptions of Black Lives Matter protests make up the race of protesters and whether they are outside agitators and means whether they are mostly violent or peaceful, influence support for their message, controlling for attitudes about race, crime, and policing. So I want to finish the class by asking a question about authenticity and protest and authenticity and writing. Does one need to occupy a certain position in order to articulate a set of questions or ideas or demands? Is it possible to really be in solidarity with those who experience oppression if one does not experience it? And I think this is a central question to identity politics in our time. Who can really speak to matters of race? Does one need to be a person of color? And if so, does one need to be a working class person of color, or a poor person of color, or a queer person of color, or a person of color with disability to really understand oppression or to discuss oppression? And if we understand identity politics as this kind of zero-sum situation, then what does this mean about solidarity? Do we then not have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with the most oppressed people? And I think the politics of protest are really important because we can all engage in forms of protests, in forms of solidarity. We can all bear witness to the world. So I'll finish with this quote in the interest of time. I'll post the slides online, and I will post a longer lecture that discusses the final articles online as well. But in the interest of time, because this is the final class, and many of you are still working on your final assignments, I will end with this quote: "Justice is what love looks like in public." Cornelius. So that is the class, and I hope that you have enjoyed the class, and I'm looking forward to marking your final assignments. Please let me know if you need an extension or you have any questions about the final. It is technically due today, but if you need to hand it in tomorrow, you can also hand it in tomorrow. The Moodle will be, the assignment tab on the Moodle will be open. So please try to hand it in as soon as possible. And thank you very much for your participation in the class. I hope that you enjoyed our course, and I hope that you are doing well. Thank you.